Oh, you've got some nerve, don't you? The crowd gasps. Silence falls over the studio. The air, thick with tension. The host, cocky and self-assured, leans back in his chair, wearing that smug little smirk. He thinks he's in control. He thinks he's the star of the show. But Morgan Freeman? Oh, he's about to remind everyone what real presence looks like. It started like any other talk show. Cameras rolling, audience clapping, the host eager to stir up some controversy. He wanted to provoke Morgan, throw him off his game. He interrupted, made snide remarks, even chuckled at his own weak jokes. Morgan, ever the gentleman, he let it slide. At first, a nod here, a patient smile there. But then the host crossed the line. So, Morgan, the host sneered, leaning in. People say your voice could make a shopping list sound profound. But honestly, don't you ever get tired of just talking? Laughter rippled through the audience. But it wasn't the good kind. It was forced, uneasy. The kind that happens when people aren't sure if they should be laughing at all. Morgan didn't flinch. He leaned forward, slowly. His fingers tapped, the armrest steady and deliberate. His gaze, piercing, locked onto the host like a hawk sizing up its prey. And then, in that deep, unmistakable voice, he said, "You know, silence is a powerful thing. You should try it sometime." The room froze. The host's smirk? Gone. His confidence? Shaken. He opened his mouth, then shut it. He had nothing. Morgan wasn't done. His voice, smooth yet firm, rolled through the room like a thunderclap. "I've spent my life telling stories, not just with words, but with meaning, with respect. That's the difference between talking and being heard." The host shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. No cue card could save him now. Morgan went on. "You came here for entertainment, but conversation? It's not a game. If you listen, really listen, you might actually learn something. About the world, about people, about yourself." The silence stretched. His words hung in the air. Then, applause. Slow at first. Then thunderous. The audience was on their feet. They had just witnessed a masterclass in poise, wisdom, and absolute dominance. "The host?" He forced out a weak chuckle. "Well, Morgan, I guess that's why they call you the best." Morgan leaned back, calm, unshaken. A small smile tugged at his lips. "I don't need to be the best," he said smoothly. "I just need to be heard." The audience exploded again. Cheers. Whistles. The host? His confidence had cracked. Just slightly, he cleared his throat, flipping his cue cards like they held an escape route. "So," he said, grasping for control, "I guess that's your way of telling me to shut up?" Morgan raised an eyebrow, amused, unimpressed. Not at all. He let the words settle before continuing. "Talking is easy. Saying something worth listening to, that's the real challenge." The audience murmured in agreement. The host, desperate now, tried one last attempt to regain his footing. "All right, Mr. Freeman, since you seem to have all the wisdom in the world, what's the best advice you've ever been given?" Morgan didn't hesitate, didn't even blink. "Never raise your voice, and when you can raise your words." Boom. Another wave of silence. Another moment of realization. The host swallowed hard. He knew. He was outmatched. He looked around, searching for anything, an easy way out. But Morgan wasn't finished. "Respect," Morgan continued, his voice softer now but no less commanding, "isn't about how loud you are, or how many people you can impress in a room. It's about understanding that everyone you speak to has a story, just like you." He glanced at the audience, his gaze settling on different faces. The difference between a great storyteller and someone just making noise. One speaks to be remembered, the other speaks to be noticed. The crowd erupted. This wasn't just applause, it was admiration. The host? Speechless. He leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "Well, Morgan," he exhaled sharply, "I think I just learned something." Morgan's eyes twinkled with wisdom. He smiled. Then my job here is done. And just like that, he leaned back, relaxed, as if he had never been challenged at all. The host, humbled. He glanced at his notes, pointless now. He had planned for witty banter, maybe a few jokes at Morgan's expense. But what he got, something else entirely, something real. With a small, self-aware smile, the host rubbed the back of his neck. You know, Morgan, I came into this thinking I was the one running the show. Morgan chuckled, that deep, warm, unforgettable sound. Oh, you are. He leaned in slightly, eyes twinkling. I just reminded you what a real conversation looks like. The audience roared. Cheers, claps, laughter. Even the host, completely outmaneuvered, couldn't help but grin. The tension, gone, replaced by something else. Respect, understanding, maybe even admiration. With the same quiet authority that had dismantled an entire ego, Morgan Freeman spoke. Be careful with your words. They can cut deeper than any blade, or heal wounds no doctor can reach. The choice is yours. The audience was silent, hanging on to every syllable. The host, for the first time that night, didn't attempt a witty comeback. Instead, he simply nodded. That, he admitted, is the best answer I've ever heard. Morgan gave a slow, knowing nod, an unspoken acknowledgement. Lesson learned. The camera zoomed out, the applause swelled, and in that moment, everyone understood. This wasn't just another interview. It was a masterclass in grace, wisdom, and the undeniable power of words. The applause faded. The host exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. The energy in the room had shifted. What started as a typical late-night interview had transformed into something unforgettable, something that would be replayed, quoted, and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The host, no longer hiding behind his usual bravado, leaned forward. There was no act now, just genuine curiosity. Morgan, he said, I have to ask, where does that wisdom come from? Is it life experience? The roles you've played? Or have you always been this insightful? Morgan smiled, folding, his hands together. His voice, as always, was steady, measured. Wisdom comes from listening, he said. Not just hearing, but truly listening. To people, to life, to the moments in between words. The host nodded, absorbing the lesson in real time. Most people, Morgan continued, go through life waiting for their turn to speak. They don't really hear what's being said. But if you stop, if you truly listen, you'll find the world has been teaching you something all along. A soft murmur rippled through the audience, as if they too had just realized how often they spoke without listening. The host sat back, letting the words settle. Then with a chuckle, he said, I feel like I should be paying tuition for this interview. This is less of a talk show and more of a life lesson. Morgan let out a deep, amused laugh. Well, he said, education comes in many forms. Some lessons are taught in classrooms, others in conversations. The host nodded. And tonight I think we all just got a lesson we won't forget. The audience erupted into applause, not out of obligation, but out of sheer admiration. As the cameras panned out, the host turned to Morgan one last time. Mr. Freeman, I started this interview thinking I'd entertain the audience, but somehow, you did something much more powerful. You made them think. Morgan gave a slow nod, his signature half-smile appearing once more. That, he said, was the point all along. The screen faded to black, and in living rooms across the world, people sat in silence reflecting on the words of a man who had just reminded them of the power of wisdom, patience, and above all, listening. As the credits rolled and the studio lights dimmed, the audience lingered in their seats, reluctant to leave. This wasn't just another talk show episode. It was a moment, the kind that stays with you long after the noise dies down. Back on stage, the host stood up, extending a hand to Morgan. This time, It wasn't the forced, TV-friendly handshake, meant for the cameras. It was real. "You got me good tonight," the host admitted with a chuckle. "I came in thinking I'd get a few laughs at your expense, but instead, I got schooled." Morgan took his hand, shaking it firmly. "No," he said with a warm smile. "You just got reminded." The host raised an eyebrow. "Reminded of what?" Morgan's gaze was steady. "That words matter, that people remember how you make them feel, and that respect earns more respect." The host exhaled, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered. "You really don't miss, do you?" Morgan simply smiled. As they turned toward the backstage area, a producer rushed up, headset still on, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Freeman," she said, "I just want to say that was incredible. We've had a lot of guests, but I've never seen a moment like that before." Morgan gave a humble nod. "Well," he said, "sometimes people just need to be reminded of what really matters." The producer grinned. "And what's that?" Morgan paused, glancing around at the lingering audience, the crew still frozen in admiration, the host still digesting the night's lesson. Then, in that deep, unmistakable voice, he said, "That the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one worth listening to." And with that he turned and walked toward the exit, with the quiet confidence of a man who had said everything that needed to be said. As the doors closed behind him, the world knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just another interview. It was a lesson, one that would echo far beyond the studio walls. The echoes of that moment would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. As Morgan Freeman stepped out of the studio, the cool night air greeted him. He took a deep breath, unfazed by the flashing cameras of the waiting paparazzi. A reporter rushed toward him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Freeman," she called, slightly out of breath. That was, honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a talk show moment quite like that. You left the audience speechless. How does it feel to have that kind of impact? Morgan adjusted his coat, offering a small smile. "I don't aim to leave people speechless," he said. "I just hope they walk away thinking a little differently than they did before." The reporter nodded, preparing another question, but before she could speak, a young production assistant hurried out from the studio. His face was a mix of excitement and nerves. "Mr. Freeman," he called, slowing as he approached. I just wanted to say, I've worked on this show for 2 years. I've seen a lot of interviews. But tonight, that was different." Morgan studied the young man for a moment, recognizing something familiar in his eyes. "And what made it different for you?" The assistant hesitated before answering, his voice laced with sincerity. "I guess I never really thought about the power of listening before. I always saw conversations as a way to get my point across. But the way you handled that moment, how you didn't raise your voice, didn't try to win, you just spoke with purpose. It made me realize how much I talk without really saying anything." Morgan chuckled softly. "Most people do. But recognizing it is the first step to changing it." The assistant swallowed hard, nodding with newfound determination. "I just wanted to say thank you. That was more than just a TV moment. It was a lesson." Morgan patted him on the shoulder, his voice warm yet firm. "You don't need a microphone or a camera to make an impact. Just make sure that when you do speak, it's worth listening to." As Morgan walked away, slipping into the back seat of a waiting car, the studio lights still glowed behind him. The world would talk about what had just happened. It would be clipped, shared, debated. Some would call it a masterclass in humility, others would call it a takedown. But for those who truly listened, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something far greater, a reminder, a lesson, and above all, proof that the right words, spoken with the right intent, could change everything. As the car rolled forward, city lights flickered past his window. He sat in silence, his hands resting calmly on his lap, lost in thought. He'd done countless interviews over the years, been asked the same questions in 100 different ways, but tonight had been different. The host had expected an easy conversation, maybe a few light-hearted jokes at Morgan's expense. Instead, he got something far more valuable. A lesson in humility, wisdom, and the art of true conversation. Reaching into his coat pocket, Morgan pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. Its pages were curled from years of use. He flipped to a page filled with scribbled notes, thoughts, quotes, reminders he had collected over time. He took a pen and slowly wrote down a single sentence. The most powerful voices are the ones that don't need to shout. Closing the notebook, he let the words settle. At a red light, his gaze drifted to the sidewalk. A young woman sat on a bench, headphones in, completely absorbed in a book. Nearby, a street performer strummed his guitar, his voice soft but full of emotion. A businessman rushed past, too busy on his phone to notice the world around him. Morgan smiled to himself. Everywhere stories were unfolding, some loud, some quiet, but all meaningful in their own way. As the car moved again, he leaned back, closing his eyes. He had nothing more to say. The world had heard him tonight. And if they were truly listening, really listening, maybe, just maybe, they would carry that lesson with them. The hum of the engine filled the silence. He wasn't one for unnecessary words, but his mind kept turning. Not about the interview. No, that moment had already passed. He was thinking about what came next. For decades he had told stories, lending his voice to characters who left an impact, shaping narratives that made people feel, think, reflect. But tonight had reminded him of something important. Sometimes the most powerful stories weren't scripted. Sometimes they happened in real time. The driver, an older man with silver-streaked hair, glanced at Morgan in the rearview mirror. That was quite the show tonight, he said, his voice carrying the warmth of familiarity. Morgan smirked. You were watching? The driver chuckled. I always watch when you're on. You don't just talk, you say something. And that host, he didn't know what hit him. Morgan shook his head. It was never about hitting him. The driver nodded knowingly. Nah, I get it. You weren't trying to put him in his place. You were trying to show him there's a better place to be. Morgan looked out the window, watching the world blur past. Something like that. The driver was quiet for a moment before speaking again. You ever get tired of it? Morgan turned to him. Tired of what? Being the voice of wisdom. Always having the right thing to say. People expecting you to have all the answers. Morgan exhaled slowly, considering the question. Then, after a beat, he said, Wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing which questions are worth asking. The driver let that thought settle. Then, with a grin, he tapped the steering wheel. See, that right there? That's why people listen. When you talk, Morgan chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe, but I'd rather they listen when the world talks. The car pulled up to his home, a quiet, unassuming place, fitting for a man with nothing to prove. The driver put it in park and turned to him. Before you go, he said, if you had one last piece of advice, not for a talk show host, not for an audience, just for someone like me, what would it be? Morgan studied him for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. Never underestimate the power of silence. It teaches, it heals, and most importantly, it gives you time to truly hear what's being said. The driver nodded, absorbing the words. I'll remember that. Morgan stepped out of the car, adjusting his coat as the night air wrapped around him. He gave the driver one last nod before heading inside. As the car drove away, disappearing into the night, Morgan Freeman did what he always did after a moment like this. He sat in the quiet, and he listened.